John 19:26 through 27. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." Minister through misery. Have you ever been miserable? You know that place of emotional, physical, or even spiritual unrest? Misery, a place of continuous discomfort. Misery, a state where satisfaction appears stale and happiness is hiding. Have you ever been miserable? Misery drains our energy and sags our spirit. The adage, misery loves company, is true. When we look down the hall of history, we see those in the company of misery. Black people being enslaved and forced to live in inhumane conditions, being killed and incarcerated at a higher rate than any other race. Misery, economic disparity that is increasing between the have and the have-nots, and banks on the verge of collapse. Misery. Misery loves company. Let's look at another event in the hall of history that memorializes misery. This event occurs in the jurisdiction of Jerusalem on the grounds of Golgotha, where misery is magnified. Here we see a Jew called Jesus hanging on a Roman's rugged cross, freshly stained with his blood. Can you imagine Jesus swollen approximately 3 times his normal body size, floating in and out of consciousness because of excruciating pain surging through every fiber of his being? Can you see dry blood on his body from severed flesh and veins because of a brutal beating at the hands of the Scorpion unit of Jerusalem's police force? Can you see his limped body being supported by spikes that were driven through his hands and feet, a crown that punctured and pierced his brow and temple? Can you see coagulated blood being mingled with fresh blood as it trickles down his face and into his eyes, distorting his vision? Yet, through distorted vision, falling in and out of consciousness with poisonous, penetrating pain, maddening misery, Jesus peeps through swollen pupils and looks out on those gathered at his crucifixion and focuses in on a familiar silhouette. Perhaps for a split second, his visual perception clears just enough to communicate with his visual cortex, which stimulates his optic nerve that signals a long-time memory, causing him to recognize the silhouette as the face of the one who birthed him into being. He sees the face of the one who nurtured and nourished him in Nazareth, the face of the one who had confidence in his abilities and gave him his first public platform to perform ministry at a wedding when the wine ran out. He sees his mother. Through distorted vision, he sees her pain, her misery, as she stands helplessly by, watching the life of the one to whom she gave physical life slip away. Whose misery is worse, since misery loves company? Jesus realized he's miserable, but his mother is also miserable. And Jesus does the incredible. He ministers through his misery to his mother to ensure that she would be nurtured after his death. Jesus physically and emotionally is miserable, but Jesus is still a good son and ministers through agonizing, excruciating, unrelenting, death-gripping pain to attend as best as he can from where he was to someone else's need. That's a word for us. While we're hurting, someone else is also hurting. While we're in misery, somebody else is also in misery. While we are marginalized and mistreated, others are also. And ministering through our misery will cause us to acknowledge that God's strength is made perfect through our weakness. Ministering through misery causes us to look beyond ourselves and see that we're not the only ones who've ever faltered and failed, not the only ones in a messed up marriage or raggedy relationship. Why? Because misery loves company. There are others in the company of misery, and since we are among the miserable, we might as well minister. Maybe we should emulate Paul and Silas. You sing, I pray, God will show up. Ministering through misery causes others and us to see that greater is God who is in us. Have you ever ministered through your misery to ensure the needs of the others were met, had to dry your tears so someone else could cry on your shoulders? Yes, we're hurting. Yes, we're going through. Yes, we're experiencing a crucifixion, but God calls us to still minister. And when we minister through our ministry, authentic ministry occurs. Ask the badly beaten who was left for dead on the winding road somewhere between Jerusalem and Jericho until that marginalized second-class citizen of a Samaritan came by. Ask anybody who's ever experienced injustice but continues to fight for justice. When we minister through our ministry, God is glorified. People are protected and cared for. Just as Mary before Jesus hung his head in the locks of his shoulders, breathed his last breath, gave up the ghost and died and was placed in a borrowed tomb. He was taking off that blistering blood-stained crook's cross and placed in a cold, dark tomb, but still he ministered through his misery until the end. When we minister through our misery, we're saying, if I could help somebody as I pass along, if I could cheer somebody with a word or song, if I could show somebody that they're traveling wrong, then my living shall not be in vain. If I could do my duty as a Christian ought, if I could bring back beauty to a world upraught, if I could spread love's message as Jesus taught, even from a miserable cross, then my living shall not be in vain. Yes, we are called to minister through misery. Have you ever ministered through misery?